So when you first start sewing, it's very intimidating. The machine, the supplies, the fabric, what are we doing? So I want to go over a couple of basic things about that's true for any machine, so about sewing with a sewing machine. The first thing is you're going to have your thread usually mounted on a post like this. You just sit it straight on the top, and then you're gonna pull that out, and the way you thread your needle is gonna be different with every machine. I'm actually doing it as I'm talking, and it may be more or less complicated based on your machine. You will have a user's guide that are usually so good about teaching you how to do that. If you happen to have an old machine and it doesn't have a user's guide, they are available on the internet. Thank goodness for the internet. So you can actually type in, for example, mine would be Brother CS6000I User's Manual PDF, and it will bring up that user's manual, and you can look at it as if you were paging through it at home. So you're gonna have a post to put your thread on. You're gonna have a bobbin winder. Now this is what a bobbin looks like. I'm gonna sit it right here. This is a bobbin. And you will take your thread and wind the thread around that tiny little bobbin on this bobbin winder. Almost every machine has one, and it's almost always in this configuration. And so you'll get, you always want to start with a full or mostly full bobbin. You don't want to run out of bobbin thread in the middle of your project. So I have already wound this one. You can see I'm using blue thread on the top. The bobbin is red. And so when you're sewing, this top thread is what's going to be what you see on the top of the fabric. The bobbin thread is what's going to be underneath on the second piece of fabric, and those two come together, and that's that needle going in and out, and so it attaches together, and that's what makes the seam. So it's important that you have enough bobbin thread and that you have enough thread. It's just called thread. It's not called thread on the top to be able to sew. The great thing about quilting is that a lot of times you're not doing, at least in the piecing, which is when you take the squares and sew them together, or the triangles and sew them together. In the piecing, you're not doing long seams. And for that reason, you can use your judgment about how much thread you need. When you get into quilting, that's a whole other animal, which we'll cover that later. But for now, we want to make sure you have enough thread in your regular spool of thread, and you want to have a full bobbin. Now, loading your bobbin into your machine can be very complicated, or actually very easy. This machine that I have, this is my plain, it's called a domestic sewing machine. So it's not a quilting, it has all different features. This one is one of the easiest bobbins to load that I've ever had. Yours might have a little container that you slide the bobbin in, and you have to attach it underneath. But I'm just gonna slide mine in here, click that down on top of it, and it's got a little cutter, so I get rid of my extra thread. And then now I started this process and I stopped because I was talking. That's pretty typical of me. P.S. So I'm going to thread my needle. Now you want to start with a new needle with every new project. They actually dull pretty quickly. So you want to get a new needle. For quilting, you're going to use a 90-14 needle. You can also use a 75/11. I use the 90-14. And I'll teach you a little trick that I learned about threading the needle. It's tempting. I don't know if any of you grew up with grandmothers that sewed. When they couldn't get the needle threaded and they're going like this, and they would lick that thread and try to stick it back so that the frayed ends will go through the teeny tiny little needle hole. Well, come to find out, if you do that, especially if it's cotton thread, which if you're quilting, it's probably going to be cotton thread, it actually makes those threads absorb the liquid, and they actually get fatter and they fray easier. And they also untwist. So better is if you try it and you try it again and you try it again, and every time you miss it, it frays the thread. Just get your scissors. Just get your little snips. So these are snips. These are snips. And these are scissors. And just, I mean, it's a 1/4 inch of thread. It's really okay. Just waste it. Cut that little bitty bit off so that you have a nice clean cut and a blunt end. Now my vision has gotten not great in the last few years, so you're gonna get to see me struggle through this, but I'm gonna thread my needle. Now, here's the thing about when you first start sewing. You get the needle threaded and you think you're ready, but it needs to go under your presser foot. Your thread should always be under your presser foot. The presser foot is this part right here. And this one happens to be metal and clear. Sometimes they're all metal. Sometimes this little part at the bottom is all clear. That's what holds the fabric both together and pulls it through the machine. And the little teeth that are underneath the presser foot are called the feed dogs, which is just kind of weird. So you want your thread to go through your needle. You always thread the needle from the front to the back. Never go back this way. You always go from the front to the back, and then you hold your thread and you get it underneath your presser foot and back behind. You don't have to have this much, but you can. You want to have enough thread of like a little tail here so that when the needle goes up to come back down, it doesn't unthread itself. And if I had a nickel for every time I unthreaded my machine by not leaving enough tail, I would have 30 nickels. Or $100. I don't know, a lot of times, or $1 million. So you want to get your thread back to the back. Now, once you've got your bobbin loaded, which again, you'll use your user's guide to work that out, or the internet, you want to use your needle to go down into the mechanics of your machine. It's going to come through, and we need to pick up your bobbin thread and pull it to the back so that you're ready to sew. So that's what I'm going to do. Now, I'm not going to use my foot, what do you call that actually? I'm going to have to stop and we're going to have to add that in. The pedal. Thank you. So the foot pedal, which is attached to your machine, is what activates the machine, the mechanics of the machine, to pull it through. There is always a knob on the end, a round knob that you can manually move the needle up and down. You won't be able to see it maybe from this angle, but the needle is going to go up and down. You don't want to pick up your bobbin thread with your foot pedal. You want to hold this back tail so that it doesn't go back, get sucked down in there. Use your little knob, and I'm going to go down and up, and as I'm coming back up, I'm pulling the thread. Now, if we could get close enough, my bobbin thread has a clear surface on the top of it, so I can actually see that blue thread coming through, and you can feel it. Sometimes there'll be just the slightest little catch, and then you want to pull that up, and it will come through right underneath your presser foot. And this is the beauty of using really brightly colored thread. So it's just this tiny little bit. I'm using the purple thing to pull it out. So I'm sticking it out where I can grab it. Now I'm going to pull that back. So these are the threads that we're going to sew with, and we're going to pull them back underneath the presser foot and behind the feed dogs. So now, from the sewing machine standpoint, my foot pedal is attached, it's plugged in, my little light is on, I'm ready to go, and essentially I'm ready to sew. There are going to be at least 3 things, but 3 things for sure that we're going to talk about. One is stitch length, and that's each stitch that goes into the fabric, the length of that per inch or per millimeter. is generally machines default at somewhere between 2 and 2.5. Mine starts at 2.5, 2.5. I suspect your machine will be the same. If it's an older machine, you may have a mechanical knob as opposed to a little digital readout. I would, if I were you, set it probably fairly close to 2.5. So in my quilting sewing machine, I have it's not a long arm quilting machine, but it has a deep thread on it. It has a mechanic, and I just literally turn the dial. So we're going to talk about the stitch length and then the tension of the two threads together, and then how to do the right seam allowance. So stitch length, if it's not at 2.5, I would set it at 2.5. That's just a great starting place, great place to learn. So that's that. Now, in quilting, the quilting world defaults at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. If you're used to sewing, almost all patterns in sewing use a 5/8 seam allowance, which is obviously just a little bit above a 1/2 inch. In quilting, it's always a 1/4 inch unless it's specified. I've yet to see a pattern that specifies anything other than a 1/4 inch. So for different machines, different presser foot, you have to figure out where a 1/4 inch seam allowance is on your machine. The vast majority of machines will have this metal plate right here. Let me use my purple thing. So, and you can see, like if I look through, if I back up just a smidge, there's a mark back here at the back that shows the 5/8 seam allowance. And it's also right here. It doesn't say 5/8, but that's where it is. There's also a 1 inch mark, et cetera, et cetera. This particular machine has a mark for a 1/4 inch seam allowance here and back here in the back, which makes 0 sense to me because I'm not feeding the fabric from the back, but what else? So there's a mark back here that says 1/4 inch. When I started sewing, quilting on this very machine, I really wasn't sure how to get a 1/4 inch seam allowance because as soon as I put fabric down, I could barely see the 1/4 inch seam allowance mark. Can you see that right there? So ideally, I would line my fabric right up on that line. There's a little bit of a difference, as you can see, between where the needle is going in and where that 1/4 inch seam allowance is. So what I did is I practiced. And what I discovered in practicing was that where my eye tends to go is actually much closer to up here by the needle. And it just so happens that there is a little groove where my presser foot connects to the machine that is exactly a 1/4 inch. So if I were to draw a line with a marker or put a piece of tape, it just connects all the way from here. You can see where that fabric is, right to that line. And then of course, if I extended it to the back where no one needs a marking, it would go to that 1/4 inch. I'm not salty about that at all. So I am one of those people, I don't know if you guys, when you learn to drive and your dad or your mom was teaching you how to drive and they tell you the further down the road you look, the straighter you will go. And I had to really train myself not to watch the road basically go under the car. And so I was constantly trying to keep the car straight. And you know, when you're looking right here, you're not going to have a nice straight line. But if you're looking as far as you can, then you're going to be much more likely to get a straight line. So I'm going to do that for us now. I'm just going to sew this little piece of white fabric. I've got my blue thread on the top. I have not adjusted my tension, my thread tension, so we may get a lesson before we get the lesson. So, and while I'm doing this, it's a good time for me to probably say, quilting is not a race. We're not Jeff Gordoning this thing. it's really a lot of quilting is learning to be patient and take your time and be precise. So what I'm doing right now is I am watching that fabric go, and I'm imagining that it's crossing that invisible line right there. And so I'm gonna do this little row, and I'm having to pull just a little bit or push from my left hand just to keep it straight. Before I get to the little end of this row, it is tempting when you get in that last inch to go like right through it. And I do that all the time. And if you look at my seams on my quilting before I sew them, I will come in just a little bit because I am not staying on top of holding my fabric all the way to the end, but you want to do it all the way to the end. Now, if you're worried about running that needle right through your finger, first of all, I've never known anybody do that. I'm sure there are people who have done it, but I have never done it, and I've never known anybody that did it. If you rest your finger right on the edge of the presser foot, you will not get your finger under the needle because the presser foot you get to the presser foot before you get to the needle. So you want to watch it all the way to the edge of the fabric. Now I'm actually going to let that run a little bit more. My machine has a feature where the needle stays in, and I have a little button that I can push to make the needle go up to get ready for the next row. I'm going to lift my presser foot up from the lever that happens to be on the back. Now, you can stretch this out and most machines have a little like razor blade nested, and you can cut it. I have gotten to where I use my snips more for two reasons. One of them is I don't like to pull because if my tension isn't right, sometimes it will cause this to bunch up. So you can see right there, that's a pretty straight line. So yay for me. I'm going to use my ruler that happens to have, you can see on here, it has, so that's a 1/4 inch, that's a 1/4 inch for a total of 1/2 inch there. So I'm just going to check, and yep, it is right there on that 1/4 inch. And so you want to try to be as precise as possible, especially in quilting. And if that's your marker, like if it's as close as you can get, use that consistently throughout. You're going to have times where you drift a little bit. That's okay. Don't freak out. But the straighter your seam and the closer to a 1/4 inch seam allowance, the better it's going to be. So if you look on the top side of that seam, you can see each individual stitch, but it really looks almost like a solid line. If I flip it over on the back and you can see the red, I don't know if you can see it, but a little bit of that blue thread is poking through. So at every stitch, there's one, there's one, there's one, and I can feel it. There's like a little, almost like a little bump there. So what that means is that my tension on my thread is not exactly where it needs to be. The goal would be to have the top stitches straight in a line, but not look like a straight line. It needs to have visible, definable stitches so you can see where each stitch is. And likewise on the back. So the red should be visible, defined stitches with none of the top thread showing through. And likewise on the front, I don't want to see any of those red threads. Now, sometimes if your fabric is thin, there's not much to be done about it. So now we're going to talk about thread tension. And it's a tricky topic. So on your machine somewhere, mine is on a dial on the top. Sometimes it's on a knob on the front. There's this little dial, and this is how much tension is being put on the needle and the bobbin. Some machines you can alter the tension of both the top thread and the bobbin. I say, ooh, that's quicksand. Stay out of that. Just do the one. So we're gonna start at the very highest tension so you can see what that looks like. All right. So this is the situation where it's putting the most tension on that top thread. I'm gonna do a whole row here, and it's crawling already because it's putting so much tension on it. So this is the thing that I do. Do you see how that just got wider right there? Because I let go of it and I don't watch it all the way to the end. All right, so I lift my presser foot lever up and pull it out, snip that. Now, if you look right here, you can already see, even comparatively, there's a just straight line. You can't tell exactly where the stitches are, and if you look really, really closely, you can see the red thread poking through everywhere that stitch went down into the fabric. Let's see what it looks like when I turn it over. Well, and first of all, just even at glance, you can see how wavy that is, and it's because it pulled that fabric so tight with the thread. On the back, it also actually is kind of a straight line, and so you just don't have those nice, defined, clearly defined stitches. So we know that's too tight, so let's back up. That was I'm gonna mark it. That was a 9. We're gonna go down to a 6 so we can see a very big difference. Sometimes you can't tell when you just change a little bit at a time. So same exact, this time I'm actually lining my seam up on my edge of my presser foot. Let's see if I can do better at the very end of this stitch than I did at the last one. Maybe not. Okay. All right. So you can see a much more defined stitch there. Less red. I don't know if you can see it from where you are. And then on the back, we're getting a little bit more clearly defined as well. So let's go down 3 more. So I'm going down to 3. Mine happens to go 0 to 9. Your machine may be different, but I want to point out before we do that, look, do you see how that has puckered and waved that fabric? Right here, where that next stitch was, it's already lying much flatter. So that's a good indication that, because you want the fabric to be able to lie flat. I will tell you, if you're gonna work with men's dress shirts the way I do, sometimes the fabric has such a high thread count and it's so tightly woven that it just puckers either way. It will relax with ironing and steam. All right, so let's do it. Now we're on 3. I did better with that one. All right, so it's lying even more flat. I can see even less red. And then on the back, we're starting to see a little more clearly defined. But ironically, the top blue threads are starting to poke through just a little bit on the bottom now. So the red is not really coming through on the top as much, but but the blue from the top is coming through to the bottom, which makes sense because it's getting looser and looser, and there will come a point, and it's probably next, that we'll see that reverse. So now I'm gonna go down to, well, let's just go all the way down to 0. So that was a 3. this would probably be the fastest I would ever sew anything. And the only reason I'm sewing this quickly now is because it's just a straight line and I'm not having to really monitor my seam allowance. If I were watching my seam allowance, I'd probably go half that speed. When I first started quilting, I like a good speedy seam, and it's just not that kind of craft. Maybe there are people out there that can do it. I'm not one of them. And if you're learning, I would suggest that you don't try. All right, so now we have no red threads at all and much more clearly defined, although this one is actually still, you can kind of see where each seam is now. There, now that I've given it a little bit of shadow, you can see that like bump, 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 bump. So those are your stitches. But when I turn it over, and this is how we know we've gone too far, you can see that top blue thread on the underside, and it is almost as if that bobbin thread wasn't pulled into the fabric at all. It is so much of a straight line that I could very easily probably just pull that, yep, just straight out. If I had enough to get a whole grip on it, I could probably pull that out without even creasing the fabric, if I could get a pull on it. So it's just a straight, almost a straight line. And as I run my finger across it, it is so bumpy, it's like perforated almost, except it's sticking up through, not punched down in. So that is something that you want to avoid, because what that means is the two threads have not come together in the middle of the fabric. It's the top thread has gone on through, and that seam wouldn't hold. That's not going to be a good solid seam. See how just that little bit of tug and it's coming apart. That's not what we want, obviously. We don't want our seams to come apart. So if that was a 0. So somewhere probably between 3 and 6. And this is one of those things where you just kind of have to play with it to find your exact tension. I will tell you, and I tried to make this happen in practice, I have gotten my tension so high on the top that the bobbin thread literally becomes like a bird's nest on the back. It's just all the loops come through and it's just a mangled mess. So if you ever have that, do not panic. Your machine is not broken. Your tension is off. So anytime those bobbin threads are like gobbledygook on the bottom, if they're just bird's nesty, tangled, way loopy, and a lot of times it'll look like just a wad of thread, then your tension is too tight. If the back of your fabric, it looks like your bobbin thread is a straight line and you can feel all the bumps, listen to that. That's just my fingernail. So this is my fingernail on the fabric. This is my fingernail. Everywhere you hear that bump, that's a thread from the top that came all the way through. And it's not. It's supposed to go into the middle of the fabric and meet up with the bobbin in the middle of the fabric and lock there in place. So that's a lot. It's a lot. But if you can, even make yourself a practice, and you can see, because sometimes I forget and I get the bird's nest and I panic and then I don't know which way to go, especially if my tension is set on like 4. I don't know which way to go to fix it. So if you want to make yourself a little practice piece just like I did. Now I'm getting this other fabric out because, to add insult to injury, each fabric behaves differently. So these are significantly thinner. We're gonna leave it, actually let me bump it back up to 3, which was kind of a good place. In the meantime, I have looked at my needle and my little thread has come out from underneath my presser foot. So I'm gonna re-establish home base. I'm gonna slide that back under my presser foot. And I'm gonna do this little piece of fabric. You always wanna put right sides of fabric together, which seems like that would be obvious, but I can't tell you how many times that I've gotten in a hurry and sewn wrong sides together, or sewn one right and one wrong. So when you're quilting, you know, we're sewing the right sides together so that when we open up the seam, this is what's gonna show on the quilt. That right there is what's gonna show on this quilt. Let's see how this tension did. You can see from the top all of the individual little stitches. Looks like there's a little bit of red poking through. That's actually not bad. It's pretty good. So I can see each of the stitches on the back, and I can see each of the stitches on the front. There's a little bit of red poking through, and there's a little bit of blue poking through, but that's because this fabric is so thin. So when you're cutting your fabric for your quilt pieces, save your scraps. And so you'll cut your 4 or 5, in our case, it's gonna be a 5-inch square, which is a charm pack. Cut your squares out and then save several pieces of that fabric and use that to set your seam length, your tension, and find that 1/4 inch seam allowance on your machine, and then you don't have to practice on your good fabric that's going to end up in your quilt. One quick addendum, you can get, this is actually from my other machine, or I would have put it on this one. You can order or purchase, and sometimes they come with your machine. So you may actually have this in the little pouch of tools that generally comes with a machine, a 1/4 inch presser foot. So this one is made to have, this is a 1/4 inch and this is an 1/8 inch. So the right side is the 1/4, left side is the 1/8. That is a wonderful addition to your sewing machine. If it came with your sewing machine, please attach your presser foot. Use this one when you're quilting, and that eliminates the guesswork on where that 1/4 inch seam allowance is. So then you're not looking right here at the, like in my case, I look at the stem. You would be looking at where the fabric crosses the presser foot. So if you have that, use it. It is not necessary. You do not have to buy it, but you can, and you can go to Amazon, type in your machine, it's not serial number, model number. So in this case, it would be a CS6000I 1/4 inch presser foot. And you can order a presser foot specifically for quilting. And sometimes that is just worth it. It'll just save you some time. So that's that. That's about your basic sewing tutorial. Those are the things that you need to get started. If you have a machine like this one this one has digital controls and you can change where the needle is. So in this case, it's all the way to the left. I could actually move it to the middle or to the right. It doesn't matter where it is, as long as wherever you start with it, leave it there. So I would encourage you, if the default, in my case, it's 0 is on the left, and I default at 2.5 seam length, just start with that, learn with it there. That way when you turn your machine off and back on, it's already set to what you've learned on. If you decide to make adjustments, so like if you want your needle in the middle, you'll have to remember to reset it every time you start again. I think I covered the important first steps. I would very much encourage you, get some scrap fabric out, practice before you get ready to do your very first quilt, so that when you sit down to sew those first pieces together, you're confident, you know what to expect, and you know to pace slowly or at least moderately so that you can get the result you want. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been helpful. I'm Kathy Martin, and this is the Catbird Quilts.